The Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library holds the largest collection of publicly accessible rare books and manuscripts in Canada, and one of its major strengths is in Hebraica and Judaica, collections which are continually expanded. Among the Judaica holdings are many Holocaust-related materials. These include various rare books and journals, as well as important archival collections, such as the Otto Schneid Archive of 20th Century Jewish Art, which includes a multitude of pictures or reproductions of the works of pre-war Jewish European artists, most of whose work was destroyed or disappeared in the war. Today's event will focus on another archival collection held here at the Fisher, or more accurately, one of the most prominent Yiddish authors of the 20th century, whose writings focused on the Holocaust. Chava Rosenfarb was born in Lodz, Poland in 1923. In 1939, after the Nazi occupation, her family was detained in the Lodz ghetto for around 5 years, before being transported to Auschwitz, at which time Chava's father was separated, during the transfer, was separated from her sister, and her mother, and they never saw him again. From the hell of Auschwitz, they were later transported to a labor camp at Sessel, Germany, and later to Bergen, Belsen, where they were liberated by British forces in April 1945. Along with other survivors from that camp, they were transferred to a former German army barracks close by, which came to be called Bergen-Belsen Displaced Persons Camp. Now I want to share my screen for a couple of minutes before we actually start, before I turn to the speakers, I mean. So incidentally, the first post-war Yiddish publication for and by survivors of the Holocaust was printed in the Bergen-Belsen DP, or Displaced Persons Camp. In just over 2 years, 24 issues of Unsere Stimme was published there, with the first 4 having been written in handwriting. The Fisher Library holdings include some of these issues, and you can see the second issue here in handwriting from November 1945. And here is one that we were able to acquire recently, number 11 from July 1946. And there are pictures here from the camp itself in this journal. But turning back to Chava Rosenfarb, it was while she was in the Lodz ghetto that Rosenfarb's literary career began. And soon after the war, she published her first collection of poetry, the Ballade von Nächtliche Wald, the Ballad of Yesterday's Forest, in London in 1947. After emigrating to Canada in 1950, Rosenfarb continued writing poetry, but eventually turned to fiction, writing a monumental 3-volume epic, Der Baum von Leben, The Tree of Life, a trilogy of life in the Lodz ghetto, published in 1972. This epic chronicles the destruction of the Jewish community of Lodz during the war. And here's a page from the archives, a page from her manuscript of this book. So I want to introduce our speakers now. Goldie Morgentaler is professor of English at the University of Lethbridge, where she teaches 19th century British and American literature, as well as modern Jewish literature. She is Chava Rosenfarb's daughter and the translator from Yiddish to English of much of Rosenfarb's work, including The Tree of Life. Her translation of Rosenfarb's book of short stories, Survivors, 7 short stories, won a Canadian Jewish Book Award and the Modern Language Association's Memorial Prize in Yiddish Studies. She is also the editor of Exile at Last, selected poems of Chava Rosenfarb, as well as most recently the editor and one of the translators of a collection of Chava Rosenfarb's essays called Confessions of a Yiddish Writer and Other Essays, published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2019. This collection won a 2019 Canadian Jewish Literary Award and the 2020 J.I. Siegel Prize for Translation. She's also translated several short stories by the Yiddish classical writer Yud Lamed Peretz into English and has written in various other forms. Professor Morgentaler will be interviewed by Miriam Borden. Miriam is a doctoral candidate here at the University of Toronto in Yiddish studies in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures, collaboratively with the Book History and Print Culture program. Her research focuses on Yiddish language, loss and memory in the post-war period. Miriam, incidentally, sits on the jury of the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards, which last year awarded Rosenfarb's Confessions of a Yiddish Writer the prize in the category of Yiddish. So now I want to turn the stage over to them, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Nadav, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to the Fisher. Thank you to the Anne Tanenbaum Centre for Jewish Studies. Thank you to everybody that helped make this possible today. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to talk to you, Goldie, especially. I want to tell you, Goldie, actually, that I am a particular fan of Chava Rosenfarb because she feels to me like an extension of my own family. And here's why. Both my maternal grandparents were from Lodz. Both were survivors. My grandfather spent time in the Lodz ghetto. And he came originally from Koinski, just like Chava Rosenfarb's family. So something that's very local to me about Rosenfarb. And Goldie, I'm wondering, you and I are probably cousins, but I guess that's for another talk. That's for another day. We could be cousins. We could be. So I want to dive right in. And I want to start actually with the book that Nadav mentioned. I have my copy here, Confessions. Oh, you can't see it. Confessions of a Yiddish Writer and Other Essays. And I want to note also that the background that I have today is that manuscript that Nadav showed us of your mother's.
I love the background. I really love it.
So I'd like to dive right in. In 2019, you published a series of essays by Chava Rosenfarb in this book, Confessions of a Yiddish Writer and Other Essays. Something that emerges from that collection is that Chava Rosenfarb considered herself a real writer. Can you tell me more about that? Can you tell us about your mother's life and how she became a writer and what being a writer, Schreiber, really meant to her?
I guess she actually tells in the first essay, which is called Confessions of a Yiddish Writer, she talks about her trajectory and how she came to write the Tree of Life. But one of the things she says is that she began writing poems when she was 8. And her father very proudly showed them around to, I think, to Moshe Broderson, who was one of the big literary figures in Lodz at the time. My mother's father was a waiter at a restaurant. And so her father was very proud of her literary endeavors, even as a little girl, and he supported them. But I think for my mother writing, as she says right at the beginning of the essay, right, that she was never a scribbler. She was never someone who thought of writing as a secondary kind of occupation. For her, this was her vocation. And this was, I was going to say obsession, but that's not the right word. It was something that she had to do, that she felt she had to do pretty much all her life. Obviously, during the war years, she didn't write. But even there, when she was at the work camp, at the forced labor camp in Zazel, she wrote her poems on the top of, on the roof over her bunk in the camp. So she never really stopped writing. And so for her, it was more than just, it wasn't necessarily a way of making a living so much as a way of living. She really couldn't live without writing. And when she didn't write, she painted. So she had this tremendous creative urge that really lasted almost to the end of her life, not quite. And do you want me to talk about how she wrote the Tree of Life, or just summarize that? Or?
Yeah, well, we can get there in a minute, actually. I'm just wondering, am I right to think that her time in the ghetto actually shaped her as a writer as well, that she attended writers groups and things like that? Is that correct?
Yes, that's true. She was, when she was still a teenager, she met Simcha Bunim Shayevich, who was the great ghetto writer of the Lodz ghetto, and he introduced her to the writers group of the ghetto, and this was a group of writers who met They tried to meet regularly. I think they didn't always manage it, and read each other's works, and were really very critical of each other's works and appreciated them and critiqued them. And so this was her first introduction to the companionship of writers. And for the rest of her life, she always wanted to be part of a group like that, of a literary group. And when she came to Montreal in the early years, she became part of the group of Montreal Yiddish writers. But then, as they were mostly a generation older, and as they died, I think her writing life became very lonely, and she started to reach out to other writers, Yiddish writers in particular, like Bluma Lempel. She wrote Bluma Lempel a fan letter, but she always dreamed of being part of a community of writers. And to be a writer for her meant it was the highest possible calling.
So I guess to follow up on that, there exists this misconception about women or Yiddish writers who were women, who happen to be women, that basically the misconception is that they mostly wrote poetry and they sort of wrote nothing else. And of course, your mother's work is powerful evidence to the contrary. But she did at least begin her career as a poet. And as I understand it, she was quite taken with poetry, even as a young child. So can you speak about that transformation from poetry to prose? And generally, can you address sort of her position as a female Yiddish author?
I think that in general, it was true that most women writers in Yiddish were poets. And if you think of the big names, they're mostly poets like Ruchel Korn and Katja Moldovsky. And so I know that she was once asked, why is it that there's so many women writers in Yiddish or poets? And I'll never forget her answer. She said, it's easier to write a poem when you're scrubbing the floor because you've got a rhythm going and things like that. And I think also, I mean, what she was aiming at was the idea that for women who have household duties and children to raise, poetry is shorter. It doesn't require as much Sitzfleisch, I think, as a novel. And so I think maybe that's part of the reason why. And I'm sure there was also a lot of stereotyping that men wrote the important epics, that have heft, and women wrote pretty, the prettified literary works like poetry. Right. So I think that played into it as well. But that doesn't mean there weren't any women prose writers in Yiddish. There were them. Well, I mentioned before Bluma Lempel, who wrote short stories and was published in the Goldene. And also, of course, Bashevis Singer's sister, Esther Kreitman, wrote prose. So, and there were others, I'm sure. But I think when we think of women writers in Yiddish, mostly they're poets. But I think what happened with my mother was that she began, as you said, she began as a poet. But after a while, and she published about 3 books of poetry after she came to Canada. Most of the poems, not all, but a lot of them deal with the Holocaust. But I think she had to get the Holocaust out of her system. And to do that, she felt that she needed something, she needed a broader canvas. And I think the idea of writing something about the Lodz Ghetto actually started, she says it started when she was standing on the ramp at Auschwitz. And she made herself, what's the word I want, a vow that if she survived, she was going to write about the Lodz Ghetto. Because, which obviously was wiped out. So that idea of writing something in prose actually percolated in her mind for a long time. Although she started writing in Belgium, but she didn't really get down to it till she came to Canada. But I think she felt that poetry didn't give her the kind of scope that she needed. to tell about what happened in the ghetto, and and I think she idolized the kind of Russian novelists like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and writers like that. And I think she was right. In her mind, she was going to write an epic similar to War and Peace or any one of those large novels, because I think it was a way of saying that what happened to the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust is an epic topic and cannot be squeezed into one short volume or a few short poems.
So I'm going to pick up on that. Let's talk about Der Baum von Leben, the Tree of Life. Okay. So I guess, many survivors who wrote about their experiences did so in the form of testimony or memoir or other autobiography or other nonfiction accounts of their experiences. But Rosenfarb's magnum opus is a work of fiction, Der Baum von Leben, and it is a trilogy. Moreover, as you said, it's huge. And what it does is it chronicles as Nadav said, as you said, it chronicles the life and destruction of the Jewish community of Lodz. So I'm wondering if you can discuss Rosenfarb's choice to write a fiction account of the war, which feels to me very much like a choice. And I'm wondering if you can also, wearing your English professor hat, you could tell us what are the advantages of writing about the Holocaust in this genre? For instance, what is fiction able to tell us that nonfiction cannot? To take it away, anywhere you want to go with that.
I think the obvious advantage of fiction over writing either a memoir or a history is that it gives you a lot more freedom. You can imagine what it's like to get inside the head of Rumkowski, for instance. Right. Obviously, my mother hardly knew Rumkowski. She knew him from a distance. But in the Tree of Life, she tries to imagine what it's like to be someone who has that kind of power and yet doesn't have power, right? Because he's the puppet, really, of the Nazis, but he has the power of life and death over other people. So fiction allows her to do that, and also to go inside and to depict the various levels of Lodz society, Jewish society in Lodz at the time, and to imagine them without being constrained about whether or not someone actually said what she's having them say. On the other hand, there are certain constraints, and one of them, and I know she was very careful about this, is to be historically accurate, because part of what you don't want is to make things up that didn't happen, right? Because that's not being true to what actually did happen, which was horrific enough. So I think in that sense, she did do research. I know that. And also some of the things in the Tree of Life are actually lifted, holus bolus, from what happened. For instance, Rumkowski's speech to the mothers to give up their children to the Nazis. I think that is word for word what he actually said. So she felt constrained by historical events, but she also wanted the freedom to move, and she writes about this really beautifully, right? To move through the gutter and to move through the hohe Fenster, the high windows, the elite, and to move back and forth, so that what the novel allows her to do is to see what is it like to be a Zionist in the ghetto, or what is it like to be a capitalist in the ghetto, right? And to be cruel, right? I mean, one of the characters in the Tree of Life that I've never forgotten is Adam Rosenberg, a horrible man, really, really cruel man, right? And she gets right inside his head. And I think she wanted to see what makes people like this tick. And the novel allows her to do that. So it gave her a broad range of where she could go. But I think fiction also is problematic, and it's becoming more and more problematic when you have people writing about the Holocaust who weren't there, first of all, and who make things up. And then it becomes a different kind of thing. So I think the fact that she herself had actually lived through what she is describing gives that novel, even though it is a novel, a certain kind of authenticity that it might not have if it had been written by someone who had just done research and was trying to imagine what things were like. I mean, Rimkowski has been fictionalized many times by other writers. So there's that. But I've just been translating her last novel, Letters to Abrasha. And there's a whole section there that is very, it's very tense, but it's all based on something that I know did not happen to her and entirely made up of an escape from Lodz, right? And what happened with it. So in a sense, fiction allowed her to go places she couldn't normally go. And at the same time to live with her characters. I mean, she really did live with them. She was, when I was a child and I was growing up, and she was writing The Tree of Life, she would sometimes, I always was worried what kind of mother I was going to meet when I come home, because sometimes she would be very upset. And I was too young to realize that she'd been writing, and she was writing about something that had happened that was not pleasant to write about, and she had to imagine it. And when I got older, like when I think about it now, I think that must have taken real guts to have to relive some of the horror that she lived through and have to relive it in her imagination. So she was always writing, and that could be good, but not for a child, right? Because she was always somewhere else with her mind.
What really, I think, jumps out at me when I go through The Tree of Life is the way, as you say, she sort of inhabits these characters that she creates. And I guess the question for me of voice becomes really important in her work, especially when I think about, I believe you, Goldie, translated a diary that she kept, right, in the first days and weeks after liberation.
Right.
I think it is available to read online on Tablet Magazine.
Yes, and it's in the book.
It's available. Yeah, right. I recommend anybody here today who hasn't read it, read that. It's delightful, and it is tragic. It is horrifying, and it is uplifting. It's all of those things. So I really recommend that. What strikes me also in that work is her voice. You know, it's this singular voice of a young woman, and as you read it, you know, you're right there with her. She takes you along with you on this, with her on this really intimate journey of kind of discovering the world anew after being incarcerated for years. It's really remarkable. And you know, it's one thing to do that in the first person, right? But then to do it in the voice of someone, in the first person, but in the voice of someone that you are not, as she does in The Tree of Life. And there are like dozens of characters with so many storylines, you know. And I'm just wondering, you know, how the perspectives are stunning, right? There's girls and boys and men and women and young and old and villains and heroes, and you know, she inhabits each of these people. So I'm wondering, how did she accomplish that? Maybe we'd have to ask her. How did she develop all of these perspectives and truly inhabit them in the way that she did?
Well, I guess the easy answer is it's just the creative impulse, right? The ability to imagine. But if I can just go back to what you were saying about the diary is called the Bergen-Belsen diary.
Sure.
And it is the diary that she kept after, well, it's a diary that she supposedly kept after the liberation from Bergen-Belsen. She did keep a diary like that. But what got published is we're talking about fictionalization, she changed things around. So that I was really very shocked when I came across the text to discover things were not as I knew them to have been. I knew that she was sick on the day of liberation, right, which would have been April 15th, 1945. In the diary, she doesn't get sick till later. And then she left out things. She became very friendly with a British soldier, one of the soldiers who liberated the camps. And I came across a letter that she wrote to him saying, "Don't worry, I'm publishing my diary, but I've cut you out of it." So there is, even in things that are supposedly factual, there is still a kind of novelistic manipulation for when things might be more effective and things like that. So that, in a sense, I guess she was fictionalizing everything, really, even when it is a diary that's actually based on what she really, really wrote. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question.
I was wondering how she writes so powerfully in her own voice. How did she sort of confer that power over to these fictionalized people that she never met, she didn't actually know.
Well, I think she makes them her own, right? And so then they can say whatever she wants them to say. And I think, writers do that all the time, right? The person I teach is Charles Dickens, and he used to have a mirror, and he would make faces at himself in the mirror as he was writing, and then he would write down what he said to himself. So I think that's a kind of writerly occupation altogether. The one group when I was in Israel, I met a very religious man and his wife who asked to speak to me because they were reading the Tree of Life. And we had a very interesting conversation, and his complaint was that the one group that is not represented in the Tree of Life are the religious Jews. And I think there are religious Jews, but not Chassidim, and that's true, right? I think, I don't know why that is, but as a general rule, she tends not to go there in her fiction, although she knew a lot of very religious people.
I think you've spoken before, or you've written before. I lose track now. You've definitely described before the fact that although her poetry is not religious, she invokes religion. She invokes and in some ways, I suppose, religion is present even when it's not in her writing, right?
Yeah, I guess it depends what you mean by religion.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Bible is certainly present, and a lot of her poems are based on biblical stories. And then she has this very powerful poem of Votarangegangen in Nashilachel. I would go into a prayer house, right? And then the whole poem is about how she can't, because of what has happened, because she can't bring herself to believe in a God that would do all the things that happened to the Jews during the war, during the Holocaust. So but I think she substitutes for religion, she substitutes faith in literary activity and creativity, in things like that. She has a short story called Edja's Revenge, in which all the characters are running after culture, right? And really, I think in that story, it's clear that culture is a replacement for some kind of spiritual life. And I think in my mother's own life, she was definitely not religious, but literature, creativity of any kind really took the place of that. So in that sense, she was spiritual without being religious.
I want to pick up on something that you mentioned a few minutes ago. You would come home and find her in some state or other as she was working on the Tree of Life. So I'm wondering if you can, having seen your mother at work, having grown up watching your mother at work, what can you tell us about her process? What was the journey, for example, of a Rosenfarb story or essay or chapter from idea to finished product? Do you know anything about that?
Well, I was really young for most of the time that she was writing The Tree of Life in particular, and her poems. So my my basic attitude towards them was that they took her away from me, and I wanted her to pay more attention to me. And I once threw one of her notebooks down the incinerator because I was so upset that she wasn't paying attention. So in that sense, but you know, I was too young to really know, like, where's this idea coming from or anything like that, and also to know that much about the war, which is what she was writing about. So while she was writing The Tree of Life, it took her about 22 years. And there, I didn't really participate in that. But later on, when she started writing her short stories, then, first of all, she would read them to me. And she started to pay attention to what I thought. And then, sometimes I actually did know where the idea came from. So for instance, in one of the short stories is about the abduction of a child by a Holocaust survivor, the abduction of the child, and the Holocaust survivor abducts it from a nursery at a hospital and runs away with the child to Mexico, I think. And so that story, I was there when the kernel was planted, because it came from a radio story about a nurse who had been accused of abducting a baby. So she basically, and I think all writers do this, she got her ideas from wherever they happened to confront her. The one I don't know, and I would love to know, is where she got the idea for Edge's Revenge, which is the story of two women who change places all the time, and each one becomes the other. And that, I don't know what gave her the idea, but I remember when she read it to me, I was much older by then, but I know that she read it to me with the sense that this is a story. She was very proud of it. And she wasn't, if I said, well, what about this and what about that, she wasn't very happy to hear the criticism. But although on the whole, she was pretty good about incorporating things, but she could also be very stubborn. So some things I do know what the kernel is, and some things I don't, but mostly I know for the later work, and not really for the, well, some of the poems are obvious, right? The one about the barbed wire crossing things out, that's obviously from the ghetto. But some others, I really don't know. Or some are based on her life, like the Greenhorn is based on her own experience in a shop in Montreal. So some of them are actually autobiographical in that sense.
Right, so we can gain access to Chava Rosenfarb's own life through her fiction, which is also a fascinating kind of turn to make, right? I wonder if, well, certainly you can talk about the process of translating her work, which is something that you've been doing this for years, and you did it together with her, and that's what I want to ask you about next. That's really remarkable, I think. When I think back to Confessions of a Yiddish Writer and other essays, this volume contains personal and autobiographical essays and accounts of Rosenfarb's childhood and her experiences before the war. And it's the first time that her nonfiction writings have been published together in English. It's translated and edited by you. So I would love to hear about that. Can you tell us about and I'm also wondering, is there a difference between working with fiction and with nonfiction in your mother's work? And especially, I think this is especially interesting when you think about how close the writer really was to you. In addition to the fact that I think you work together on certain translations, right? And yes. I want to hear about all of that.
Well, the hardest thing has been to translate when she's gone, because as long as she was alive, I mean, her English was fine. There was no, so when we worked together, if I got stuck or there were words I didn't know, and she sometimes, I think her Yiddish vocabulary is very advanced, and there's a lot of Hebraisms in there that I don't know, and so I would just ask, what does this mean? But once she died, it became harder. I mean, I have dictionaries, and she uses sometimes Polish expressions, German expressions. So I have various people I call on, but I don't know what she means particularly in that particular context. And that's certainly been a drawback. But when we were working together, we fought a lot. We fought a lot over language, over diction and syntax and English. She would want to say things one way, and I'd say, you can't say it like that. It's not good English. And she'd say, yes, it is. And we'd go back and forth, and I would storm out, and then I'd storm back in. And it was, we would yell at each other. She could be very stubborn, but so am I. So it was, but on the whole, it was, I liked working with her. And I had the boss was there. I would never, when we translated Edge's Revenge, for instance, I sat at the computer. She sat next to me with the Yiddish text, and she would read the sentence aloud, and I would tell her how I was going to translate it. And if she didn't like it, or she thought it should be another word choice or something, she would tell me, and then we'd discuss it. So it was really a collaboration. Now that she's gone, I can't collaborate with anyone. So it's really, I rely on myself primarily. But now, when I translate her, I like doing it for another reason, which is that it brings her back to life for me. I feel like I'm still talking to her, especially with this last novel, Letters to Abrasha, which I have taken too long to work on. It brings her back to life. And the essays, there were a number of things that happened with the essays. I came across most of them after she died. But I came across one in particular that she did a lot of translation of her own. And she had translated many years before an essay about Simcha Bunim Shayevich. And she'd written it in English, and then she asked me to work on it, to edit it, and I edited a lot of her stuff. So I did. And then she sent it out to every Jewish American, Jewish Canadian, English language publication she could think of, and no one was interested to publish it. Partly, I think, because it's a long essay, so it doesn't really fit journal format, but I think also because nobody'd ever heard of her in English. So why bother with a writer who is so totally unknown? So she got one rejection after another, and in the end, it wasn't published. So when I came across the text after she had died, and I read it, I thought, wow, this really should be published. But I felt very insecure about it, so I showed it to David Bezmazgis, and it was his enthusiasm that told me that my instinct had been right. And he actually is the one who made a shidduch with tablet, and that's how they published her for the first time. And I remember their reactions to her. Is the first reaction I got is, can you tell us more about the writer? Is she a first-time writer? Who is this? I never heard of her before. And I wasn't surprised, because why would they have heard of her? She hadn't published anything in English up to then. So that was the first essay that got published. And once I had the ear of tablet, every time I found something else, I would send it to their editor, and I think he published everything. So that was really the genesis of this book. And then I thought, well, I'm getting, since these essays are being so well received in English, why not? There are so many. She wrote so many essays. She wrote a lot. Why not just to make a book? And so I did that. Some of them, the problem was I'm teaching full time, and I'm a very slow translator. So I asked for some help from two women in Winnipeg. They would just do a first draft for me, and then I would take it from there. So one was Roz Usiskin, and the other is Arnis Pollack. And they were a big help. So once I got the first drafts back, then I started to work on those essays as well. And that's really how the book came to be. Some of the essays, obviously, was translated by my mother herself, the Shayevich essay. Some were just translated by me. The Bergen Belsen diary is translated by me, because as I mentioned, my mother was friendly with a British soldier who liberated not Auschwitz, Bergen, Belsen. And they maintained a friendship really until she died. But and she said every she couldn't read Yiddish, but she sent him everything she wrote in Yiddish. And she sent him the diary as he wanted to read it, even though she assured him he wasn't in it. After her death, I found this translation. And I read it, and I realized Douglas had been decidedly unimpressed, and I could see why. I mean, it was not good English. It was hard to understand. So I said, I'll do this myself. And so that's how I came to translate that. That, I guess that's the story.
I have two reactions immediately to what you just said. The first is the translation, the way you describe sitting at the computer while she's sort of while she's sitting on the couch with the Yiddish. That is just, I'm just, I think about the fact that today, right now, as we speak, there are entire programs dedicated to training new Yiddish translators, because it is such an art, and it is so difficult to do that with this distance now between, the native speakers, the writers themselves, and then this new sort of generation of translators. And I think about, how remarkable that is, that what you described, that scene of watching you and her sitting next to each other. I just, amazing. It's every Yiddish translator's greatest dream to meet their authors and hear, and to argue with them. That would be, I think most translators would relish an argument with the person they're translating, to really get to what is the heart of what you're trying to say, because, and I know as a Yiddish translator myself, I know it is, so much is simply not translatable, not conveyable, so that's my first reaction. The second reaction I have is your is audience. I think it is just amazing that, Tablet, which is an online magazine with generally a young readership, that they're discovering your mother's work and going, is there more of this? Who is this writer? And then I think back to, and this leads into my next question, then I think back to an essay that I read in Confessions of a Yiddish Writer and other essays, about how heartbroken she was and how deeply she felt this kind of break when she discovered basically that she's sitting in Montreal. This is now after the war, and she's away, and that's, so I'm there's a kind of, there's something that makes me chuckle, and there's also sort of an absurdity to this idea that Tablet would be, an online magazine in the 21st century is going, who is this person? And meantime, the people who spoke that language, the people she was writing for, fewer and fewer of them were actually there to read her material while she was still alive. And so there's an interesting contrast there, I think. So I guess what I want to know is if you can now address this post-war period, her period in Montreal, where she was facing that reality, where the Yiddish, the crowds at her lectures were growing smaller. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the way she sort of negotiated this new position as a Yiddish writer in this Canadian context, right, where it's English and it's French and it's sort of anything but Yiddish, although she's in this Yiddish sort of milieu as well in Montreal, right?
Yes. Well, one thing, just to go back to Tablet, the tragedy with Tablet is that those things didn't get published until after her death. So as far as she knew, she never knew about Tablet, right? She didn't know existence, nothing. So that, in that sense, like when people write to me, I get emails sometimes praising my mother's work, and I love reading it, but it also hurts me because I wish she could read it. She wanted recognition all her life. And she got so little of it. She got it from the Yiddish-speaking world, and that yes. And she had a relationship with Sutzkever, he was the editor of the Goldie Morgentaler. And he was obviously a big name in Yiddish letters. But really, the Tree of Life itself, the English translation, went from publisher to publisher, and nobody wanted to publish it. The closest she came was she got a bite from Jack McClellan, who actually sent her a very nice letter saying he was interested. But then his board nixed it because, again, it was too long and by a writer nobody'd heard of, and too much of an investment in time, in money. So she never really got the recognition that I think she wanted for almost all her life. But in terms of, sorry, I've forgotten the first part of your question.
I was wondering if you could, sort of describe how she positioned herself in this world where the audience was fading, really.
So she wanted very much to fit in. As I said, she wanted to be part of a group of writers. She tried with Canadian writers. She wrote letters to Earl Burney and the Canadian names in literature, Margaret Lawrence. She became friends with Adele Wiseman. So she really did want to have this kind of community of writers. The original community of writers that she had in Yiddish-speaking Montreal in the 1950s, they basically died off. So she had to find soulmates elsewhere, and that's why she wrote to Blue Lempel. And she also tried to be friends with Anne Burney, who was the wife of Alfred Kazin in New York. But really, I think it was a very lonely life. She knew French very well. When I was growing up, I heard actually more French at home almost than English, because my father went to the French university and his friends were all French speaking. But it was difficult. And as she was constantly being invited to the Jewish Public Library to give talks, and as you say, the audience kept shrinking and shrinking. But the final blow, and I'll never forget this, was she was in her workroom and she came down and her face looked like some horrible event had happened. And what had happened was that Sutzkever had decided to stop editing the Goldene Kite, and it was going to go out of publication. Mm-hmm. And this was a blow. It's hard to exaggerate how serious a blow it was. And she became very depressed for a long time. She didn't write anything because she said, what's the point? Now I have nowhere to publish. And she eventually, when she sort of digested the lack of a readership, she started to write even more in English, directly into English rather than into Yiddish. Because the other thing is that from the beginning, she wanted a translator. It's like the wonderful story by Cynthia Ozick, I think it's called Enemies, where everybody's fighting over translators from Yiddish to English. Right. So the sense that Yiddish was contracting, if not actually dying, I think has been present among Yiddish writers actually for quite a long time. And that the way to be read is to go into a language that has a lot of readers, like English, obviously. French, she had a friend who translated one of her plays into French, but I'm pretty sure, and I think it was sent out to one of the French theater companies in Montreal, but I don't know what happened. Nothing happened with it, that I do know. So I don't know, that didn't go anywhere. I mean, the problem is also that people think that if you know a language, you can translate into it. And it's actually not that easy. You need a bit of skill in the language. You need to know that language really well. So a lot of the time, the problem with relying on translation to be read is you really are reliant on the translator, who is basically your interpreter to the wider world. And if you have a translator where the translation is sort of iffy, or there's something wrong with it, or it's not fluent, it's not fair, but it rebounds back to the writer. There's almost no choice about that. So I mean, in that sense, once I didn't start translating for my mother till I was in my 30s. I didn't want to do it. I really didn't want to speak Yiddish. I didn't want to have anything to do with that world. But eventually I came around. And so once that happened, I think she began to rely on me a lot more. But it was onerous, and it is still onerous. The last novel, she begged me to translate it, and I started, but it's been 10 years. I'm almost done, but it's been 10 years. And the problem is that I just didn't have, until Corona, until COVID hit, I didn't have the time.
Right. Well, I'm glad you did. I and about 100 other people here today are so glad that you did come around to translating your mother's work. And you know, the idea that she was lonely. There are over 100 people here today who would love to have, you know, a glaze of latte with her. I also, what you say about, you know, this Yiddish contracting, right, and the audience shrinking. It's amazing to me the way you describe, you know, that it was actually such a generative, you know, place for Yiddish to be. Yiddish literature continued even though the audience shrank, right? And I think, you know, there was still literature being written. Your mother continued to write. There was literature written in the 70s and the 80s and so on. And, you know, it's just amazing to me. It really, for me, is like really definition of, you know, Yiddish redt sich. Yiddish will speak itself. Even with no one else left to read it or speak it, it will speak itself. It'll find a way.
Oh, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
and go to
So I guess I have one final, I could talk to you forever, first of all. I could talk to you forever about this. And I do feel like we're really just scratching the surface today, but I do have one last question for you, because I see that we are sort of coming to the end of our hour. I want to focus on this background I have behind me, which comes from the material that you donated from your mother's archive to the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library at U of T. How did you decide that the Fisher was the right place for these materials? And how did you go about selecting which materials to preserve in this archive? Because I think this is not everything, right?
It's not, no. I eventually, the Fisher will have everything, assuming I can get back to Toronto. I have a lot of materials still that I haven't had a chance to go through, and it's all sitting. I have a condo in Toronto, and it's all sitting there. It was originally my mother's, so that's why. And I haven't been able to get back there since the pandemic started. So that I find that very frustrating. But I really have to thank Barry Wallfish, who is the husband of my cousin, who was the Judaica Librarian at U of T. He was the one who came to me after my mother died and said, you know, why don't you donate all this to the University of Toronto? In the meantime, I actually had someone from Archives Canada show an interest, but I got the impression that their interest had more to do with the fact that they had my father's archive and she was his wife. So it wasn't, I wasn't terribly impressed, whereas I did some research into the Fisher archive, and I mean, they have writers, right? They seem to specialize in Canadian writers. So I thought, well, this is perfect. And Barry was there too, so that I felt pretty secure in donating to the Thomas Fisher. I basically have given whatever I find that I think I won't need anymore. And that's been the problem. Like, I come across things, especially letters, and I think, well, maybe if I ever write a book about my mother's life, I should keep this. So there's a lot of things that, like her correspondence with this British soldier, I've held that back. I still have it. Whereas other correspondence I have given because I figure I'm not going to be using this. So Bluma Lempel, the correspondence with her, I've donated to the Fisher. I've donated her manuscripts, especially. I thought that I was donating the entire handwritten manuscript of the Tree of Life, what's behind you. And it turns out it's just a small part of it. I don't know what happened to the rest. And I keep coming across things that I don't quite know where they fit. You know, she wrote so much. So, and I'm reluctant to give it away without my first looking at it. And that's why I've been sort of donating in dribs and drabs. But hopefully, before I die, everything will go to the Fisher. So it's quite wonderful that there is a place like this, an archive like this, where people can go and find out about writers. I mean, I've been to the Fisher a few times. I'm really, really impressed. And with the job they do and the way they preserve things.
And I can tell you that as a graduate student working with Yiddish materials, I have used some of these materials, especially the ones to do with Yiddish writers that are in the Fisher. So I'm here to tell you that, you know, the materials that you donate, they are accessed, they are used. And not just, you know, I've had friends at other universities inquire about, you know, about holdings at the Fisher, because they're looking for material on Yiddish writers that we have here in Toronto. So it's kind of, it's very special, in fact. And I think your mother's material sits very comfortably among the other Yiddish materials.
Yes, I guess the place that I expected would ask for her archive never asked, and that was the Jewish Public Library of Montreal, where she spent so much time, and where she always, you know, they invited her over and over again, and she was always giving lectures, and they were not at all interested, which was a bit of a surprise to me, because I originally thought that's where it was going to go. I'm very happy it's where it is now. I think it's a much better location. But that was a bit of a surprise. She wrote on her notebook, she wrote that she wanted them to go to Evo. But I've been reluctant to send things to Evo because things, Evo's going to sue me, but things tend to get lost. I've sent some stuff to Evo and they never get, you know, a year later, they're still sitting on someone's desk. So I'm very happy that I picked the Fisher.
Us too. Us too. Well, Goldie, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening. It's just a pleasure to talk to you, as always.
Thank you.